that you can excel in very difficult circumstances.
All right.
Daniel is an example of that.
All right.
He was there not because he wanted to be, but because he had to be. Because it was Nebuchadnezzar who went to Egypt to overthrow that king, and because those Egyptians controlled Jerusalem, he went and sacked Jerusalem, took the best of Jerusalem, took them back to Babylon, and he trained them for 3 years, and they served. And Daniel and these three boys we're going to discuss this morning, all four of them excelled under pressure. I started last week talking about when your faith is under pressure, what do you do? And I really could have started with these three boys, but I wanted to start with Daniel because Daniel is to whom the book is titled. He's the author of the book, and his faith was under pressure. His faith was under pressure because there were those who saw that he was excelling under pressure, and they became jealous of him. And because they were jealous of him, they wanted to ruin him, or they wanted to get him in trouble. But guess what Daniel did? He exceeded and excelled under pressure, even though his faith was put in the pressure cooker. Daniel's faith was able to survive. And Daniel went into the lion's den with an extraordinary amount of faith. He did not let his oppression, he did not let the difficulties of his circumstance, he did not even let him being from his homeland keep him from putting his faith on display. I want to look at this one today because this one is a little different, and I've preached this text before, but let me tell you, this particular text is interesting because when your faith is in the fire, or it is put in the fire, or it's that faith that is under tremendous pressure. But when your faith has to go into a very fiery situation, and I really don't have time to explain it to you, my brothers and sisters, the way I want to, because I don't want to be long, but I want to explain to you. This is an extraordinary story, and if you only look at it based upon the historical narrative that you've heard preached over the years, you really don't get the gist of this story. And you really have to look at this story. And I love the theologian that I was studying when I was studying for this particular text, because he said there are three things you need to look at. You need to look at the historical, you need to look at the doctrinal, but you also need to look at the practical. The historical is the context, who was the king, and the circumstances that these three boys were under. They were from Jerusalem. They were Jewish exiles in Babylon. That's the historical context. Nebuchadnezzar was king, and in chapter 2, he had his dream interpreted by Daniel. And the fascinating thing about the interpretation of the king's dream by Daniel, the king wouldn't even tell anybody what he dreamed because he wanted them to figure it out. And so Daniel literally interpreted his dream, and the other Chaldeans, these astronomers, these persons who practiced magic and who were guided by the stars, they were afraid, and they said, "King, can't nobody interpret your dream unless he's a god." But Daniel, because he knew the God of heaven, the God who was sovereign, the God who was omnipotent, the God who knew the thoughts of men before they even thought, was able to interpret his dream. Not only was he able to interpret his dream, he told the king what he dreamed. And then that king, literally, he was humbled by that, and he really acknowledged God. You're going to see Nebuchadnezzar many times in his life acknowledge God, because he's going to see the power of God, the miraculous abilities of God put on display, and he's going to believe. But let me tell you, his belief is not going to last long. And one of the reasons why his belief is not going to last long, because he's going to start feeling himself. And when you get on the top, because what Daniel told him is about this statue, and the head of that statue was gold. It shined bright.
Yeah.
And he told Nebuchadnezzar, "You're that head of gold."
Yeah.
And boy, he got the feeling himself. Feeling real good because the Babylonian kingdom was strong. It was powerful. It was expansive. It was the premier power of that day. And so he really felt good about that. But between chapter 2 and chapter 3, 20 years have expired. There's 20-year gap between chapter 2 and chapter 3. And by chapter 3, we're going to be introduced to the other 3 young men that came with Daniel that the text tells us were a part of this school of re-indoctrination into Babylonian culture. We're going to be introduced to these men whose names were changed. They came to Babylon with their Jewish names, but now they are given Babylonian names of Rashak, Meshach, and Abednego. These 3 young men, they were very outstanding young men. They excelled just like Daniel. And one of the reasons why they excelled, because they were under the favor of God. And even in a tough situation, you can excel. Let me tell you, I need to go ahead and stick a pin right here. Is some of y'all excelling in very extraneous situations, difficult situations, situations where the odds are stacked against you. You went into that particular situation and didn't nobody think you were going to make it but God. They didn't understand that God, by his providential will, let you go there. And really, in his sovereign will, he put you there. And I need to tell you, wherever God plants you, you're going to grow. It might not look like you're going to grow, but wherever he said, you're going to grow in extraordinary and in very difficult circumstances. And these 3 boys, just like Daniel, was planted in a very difficult situation, and they learned Babylonian culture, and they excelled and succeeded. But let me tell you the thing they didn't do, and you really need to stick a pin right here too. I don't care how you succeed in life, don't forget God. I mean, let me tell you, because that's really what the text is teaching. Daniel went to Babylon and he succeeded and excelled, but they didn't forget God. They had God in Jerusalem. They were Jews and they believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But when they got to Babylon, they had a lot of success in Babylon. Under Nebuchadnezzar, they went to the 3-year University of Babylon, but when they went to school, they didn't forget God. And I don't care how successful you become and how successful you are, where you live in the country. I don't care how highfalutin the people are you live around, you work with, and you get a certain degree, status, and pedigree. Don't forget God. Take God with you. If you leave the ghetto and go to the corporate boardroom, take the Lord with you. If you move from the hood to the suburbs, let me tell you, take God with you. I'm trying to explain to you, these 3 young men took the Lord with them. They wanted to make sure wherever they went, they took God with them. And we're going to see in chapter 3, they took God all the way. And I need to go ahead and stick another pin. And if you take God all the way with you, he'll sure no go with you. The old folk put it like this: he's a mighty good leader. He will lead you all the way from earth to heaven. Let Jesus lead you all the way. And let me tell you, this particular text is interesting because their faith was put into the fire. It was put into the fire. So I really want to give you this because this is a great lesson. It's a great narrative. It's a great story. And I'm just trying to give you the history. But let me give you the doctrine of the text, because the history is one thing, but the doctrine is a different thing. And really the doctrine is about what you are to believe about the characters and God in the text. Because you're going to see 2 persons of the Godhead show up in this text. And it's an important doctrine about both of them. You're going to see God in the text, but you're going to see the Son of Man. And he's going to be recognized by Nebuchadnezzar. And the doctrine of God is this: where you go, God goes. And where God sends you, he ain't going to send you alone. And the doctrine is God can be counted on when you are put into the fires of life. God can be counted on. And let me tell you, God will never send you where he ain't willing to go with you. And listen, sometimes God will have to put you in the fire and you really can't see him until you get in there. Listen, sometimes God will be silent while you're walking toward what you're walking toward. And before you get in what you're getting in, you don't see him. But get there, see when God show up. I'm talking about the doctrine of God. But let me tell you, there is another person of the Godhead that shows up. But really I want to tell you, it's very interesting when he shows up. He doesn't show up before they get in the fire. And he's really not noticed by any Jewish person, but is a Gentile king. Because when Nebuchadnezzar throws them into the fire, he looks in. And my brothers and sisters, I really don't have time, but I'm trying to explain to you that Jesus shows up. And I told you last week, when he shows up after his resurrection, it's called a Christophany, and that literally means that is a post-resurrection of Jesus Christ. But you do know that Jesus Christ showed up in the Old Testament as well, and that's called a theophany. Because in Bible Study Wednesday night, we're going to see another theophany appearance of Jesus Christ, because he's going to have a conflict with Jacob, because Jacob has stole his brother's birthright, and now he stole the blessing, and then God has to meet him in the wrestling ring. And Jesus shows up. And Jesus showed up in this particular situation. He showed up in the fiery furnace. And I don't have time to explain it to you. See, that's what some of y'all don't understand. You're wondering where Jesus is. You know why you're wondering where Jesus is? It's because life is too easy for you. Listen, he don't show up in the easy times. He really show up in the hard times. And sometimes you really can't see him when things are going too well in your life. But let a hard time come. I tell you, he'll show up. You look around and he's standing right there. You look around and you see him, boy. He'll pop up. He'll pop up and he'll show up, because it's interesting. They was talking a whole lot of stuff about the Lord, but the Lord wasn't nowhere to be seen. And see, he was there, but he didn't show up yet. See, he was looking from the banisters of heaven, and he really wanted to see what kind of faith they had, because they were talking a whole lot of stuff before they got in there. Because they said, listen, even if he don't, he can. But one thing we know, we ain't going to bow. The Lord hadn't showed up yet. But boy, when they got in the fire, the Lord from the banisters of heaven said, since they got this kind of faith, I might as well go on and meet them. And see, you don't want no fiery situations in your life. You want everything to be a bed of roses. But let me tell you, if the Lord puts you in a fiery situation, you'll be able to see it. Boy, I wish I had time to preach. I'm trying to explain to you that when you get into the fiery situations in life, the Lord will. I'm trying to explain to you the doctrinal situation about Jesus Christ. Boy, if I had time, but I really don't. Boy, if you just would peruse the pages of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you will see that Jesus Christ showed up at times when people had crisis in their lives. Boy, if I had time, I'd explain to you the first event that he showed up. They did not know that there was going to be a crisis, but he did. You want to know that Jesus showed up not at the wedding feast at Cana by accident, but on purpose. Because he knew there was going to be a problem, and the only person that could solve the problem was him. There were no distilleries, there were no wine stores, and so Jesus showed up, and when he showed up, he showed out.
Yes, sir.
Well, if I had time, I'd explain to you. He shows up in the time of our crisis. And so why wouldn't you turn to him in times of crisis? I know we got politics and politicians. I know we got soothsayers and horoscopes. And we got all of these astrological signs we turn to read them every week in the newspaper. I know we got these gurus of the prosperity gospel, these apostles and these prophets and prophetess. But let me tell you who the best turn to is turn to Jesus. Turn to him. That's the doctrine. But then the theologian wanted me to tell you there's a historical lens you need to look through. There's a doctrinal lens you need to look through. But then there is a practical application. The practical application is how do you apply what it is you're reading in Daniel chapter 3. I like Dr. Creole LaRue says this. You've got to bring the then into the now. And then bring the people into the now back into the then. In other words, you bring history up so people can look at it and view it. But then you bring people back into history so that they can view it. And when you get both of them together, then you extract from the text some practical life lessons. Because there are some things to learn from these boys. There is a historical view and lens you need to look through. There is a doctrinal lens, but there are some practical things you need to apply in your own living to understand how does this relate to my life and my living. I'm glad you asked.
All right, go ahead, preacher.
Because I want to explain it to you. Now, make sure you read Exodus chapter 20, verse 5. Because if you don't read this, you won't understand these boys' behavior. Because when the children of Israel left Egypt at the foot of Sinai, in the peninsula of Sinai, they got some commandments from the Lord. 10 of them. And the very first commandment they got, these three boys are standing on that one commandment. Thou shalt have no other. Exodus 20 and 2. No God before me. And in that directed, he says in Exodus chapter 20 verse 2, he says, and you shall not worship any image. Because, see, the problem is, if you worship an image, you turn it into the little G-O-D, a God, and it competes against the big capital, high case, G-O-D, God. The first thing he said to me, now I ain't going to share you. Because when you were in bondage by reason of your taskmasters and you wanted somebody to come get you, I came and got you. I'm the one that sent 10 plagues and 12 miracles. And I got you out of Egypt, took you through the wilderness, across the Red Sea. I turned bitter water sweet. I sent bread and quail. Got you to the land flowing with milk and honey. And I'm telling you right now, if you give credit, serve, bow down to any other God other than me and you going to have a problem. And boy, if I had time to explain the historical narrative, the reason why they are in Babylon in the first place is because of their disobedience, their idleness, because they decided to turn their backs on And some of y'all need to hypothetically, personally, generally, and specifically reason that sometimes the reason why you're in trouble and having such a hard time is because you done turned your back on God.
Right, preacher.
So Nebuchadnezzar got an image of a statue in chapter 2. Now in chapter 3. Now I'm going to preach a text, and I got about 12 minutes.
All right.
And chapter 3 says that in the plain of Dura, in the ocean, this flat, let me give it to you more geographically. In the plains of Shania, I hear in this flatland. He didn't build this statue in the city of Babylon because there were already tall buildings, structure and infrastructure. So he took it out to the plains of Dura. He erected this tall statue that was 90 foot tall, 9 foot wide, standing in the middle of a plain where there were no mountains and no trees. He erected this statue because it was a god that he had created. He wanted people to come out here to the plain of Dura or Shania, or come out here and to worship this God that he created. He wanted them to bow down and worship it. And so he wanted all the important folk to be there. Verse 3 said all the important folk came out there, all that big time folk. Important folk with pedigree, finances, wealth, and position, they all showed up out there. And the king in verse 4 had his heralder to tell him now, listen, it is commanded to you, O ye people of nations and languages, that at the time of the sound of the music, fall down and worship this golden image that the king has set up. Boy, that's really the problem right there, because when you have man-made gods, that's a problem, because this is this is a God that the king set up. The king created. Let me tell you, I don't want a God that can't talk back to me. I don't want a God that doesn't have his own existence outside of the imaginations and the help of men. I need a God that lives outside of time, space, and matter. I need a God who doesn't need the counsel of anybody. He's pre-existence. He's still outside of time. He's God all by himself. I love Dr. Cecil W. Clarke says the kind of God we serve, that if God could think, where would a thought come from? Because there's nobody before God, outside of God, greater than God. He lives by himself. He counsels only with himself. But this was the God that Nebuchadnezzar had made. And listen, he commanded everybody to fall down and to worship him. And then he kind of gave the threat. The threat is in verse number 6. He says, anybody that don't fall down and worship him will be thrown in the midst of the fiery furnace. The threat has been made. And so these three boys knew the risk. They knew the threat. They knew exactly the consequences. They knew it. They knew that if their faith was going to be challenged by what he said, and so they knew the risk, but they were willing to assume the risk anyway, because sometimes that's the problem with most of us. We don't understand that there's a risk in serving God. There's risk in being faithful to God. There's risk in standing and going against the crowd and going against the flow, going against the grain. See, the problem is you don't want to stand up and stand out. You want to, if everybody else bow, you bow. If everybody else give in, you give in. Everybody else go left, you go left. It's just like being, let me bring it to you in a more modern vernacular. You've been to a club where there ain't but one door in, one door out. And listen, if something go down in that club, everybody start running in the same direction. You don't care why. You don't care for what reason. You just start running in the same Same direction. My brothers and sisters, I'm trying to explain to you, listen, these three boys knew the risk. They knew the threat. They knew the danger they were in by standing on principle. Because Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to fall down and to worship the golden image that he had set up. And then we got to go to verse 8 because I got to hurry. But I'm trying to explain to you, whenever you do what's right, whenever you take a stand, whenever you decide that you're going to be different, somebody's always watching you. Because it says in verse 8, the Chaldeans, that were these men who thought they were better than Daniel, but they weren't that much better than Daniel because they couldn't interpret the king's dream. It's the same Chaldeans in chapter 2 who could not do what the king asked them to do, but now they are watching these three Hebrew boys, and they are watching them, and they came forth to tattletale on these three. These boys didn't bow, and these Chaldeans were more than willing to go rat them out. And they said, King, in verse 10, did you not make a decree that everybody who hears the music, the horns, and this flutes, and this lyre, and this flute, this symphony, and all kinds of music, that they fall down and worship, and if not, they're going to be thrown into the fire furnace. In verse 12, he says there's some certain Jews. Let me tell you what got them in trouble. Not that they were Jews, because you got to continue to read verse 12. Yeah. Being Jews were one thing, but I don't think this was ethnic or racial. This was some kind of racial targeting or racial profiling. But you got to read the very next phrase. These Jews whom you set over your affairs. That's what got them in trouble. Because listen, they didn't like the promotion that these three men had gotten. The success that they had achieved in Babylon, because see, they were homeboys. They were already in the king's court, in the king's administration, in the king's employment, in the king's care, and then all of a sudden, here comes some outsiders. And these outsiders now have been promoted. They've been exalted. They are known and they are noticed, and the king puts them over, sets them over the affairs of the providence of Babylon. So let me tell you, and I need to go ahead and tell some of y'all young folk, when you get successful, you become a target. Yeah. Folk don't like you to be successful. People don't want you to be successful. See, that's the reason why I know some folk can't be successful. The more successful you become, the more a target is put on the back of your head. And it ain't got nothing to do with anything personal. It is people want what you have. They want to achieve what you have achieved. And if they don't, you become a target. And they said, these men, King, did not pay regard to you. They do not serve your gods, nor worship the image that you set up. And then the king said, bring them to me. And verse 15 is the king gonna try to give them a second chance. Listen, that show no faith. Listen, let me tell you something. It's one thing to say something to me one time, but let me tell you, the second time. Listen, they were defiant the first time, but let me tell you, the second time they were defiant in verse 15 is show no faith. It's one thing to defy the king outside the king's presence, but it's another thing to defy the king right to his face. Them some bad, I was almost going to say this. I mean, these were some bad brothers. I mean, listen, they weren't in the king's presence the first time they defied the king, but now they standing right in front of the king, and the king said, I know you fellas really didn't mean what you done, and you probably done it because I wasn't looking at you, but now I'm looking at you, and now we're gonna do this again. I'm gonna give you a do-over, and this time I want you to fall to your knees, and I want you to worship. I want you to worship. And he said, now, if you're ready at this time, I'm going to play the music, and I want you to fall down and worship me. But now if you don't worship, you shall be immediately cast into the fiery furnace. And boy, one commentator wanted me to tell you, the question he asked him, he asked the right question, but he didn't have the right understanding of the right question that he asked. Because what he said, who is the God that's going to deliver you from my hand? See, I almost started shouting. Because you got to know who the God is that will deliver me from your hand. Now listen, you got some hands, but your hands ain't God's hands. And my brothers and sisters, the old folk used to say, your hands are too small to box with God. And old Nebuchadnezzar said to him, now listen, you ain't going to, if you don't do it this time, who is? Oh, my brother, you got to know when to shout. Because when your enemies say such a thing as that, and see, that ain't you calling on God, that's your enemies calling on him. Because sometimes you don't have to call him, just put your faith in the fire. And if you put your faith in the fire, when your enemies challenge God, well, it's one thing for you to invite God to a party, but it's another thing when your enemies invite God because of their pride and arrogance. And listen, God didn't have really, and I'm talking about in the human sense, not in the divine and omnipotent sovereign sense, God really was forced, and Nebuchadnezzar forced God's hand.
Yes, he did.
Wait a minute now. Did you just say to them boys? Who is the God that's going to deliver you from my hand? That's some pretty strong stuff. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said to the king, and really, we have no need to answer you in this matter. Speaks. I'm telling you. Can I just stop? I know I'm a little over my time, but let me stop and explain this to you. Listen, really what they were saying, God can speak for himself. I ain't got to give God resume to you. I don't have to tell you who he is. Because in a couple of minutes, he's going to show up and prove who he is. So we ain't got to regard you in this manner who he is. Because it's one thing for somebody to tell you who he is, but it's another thing when he showed them who he is. See, I done told you before. He's a battle axe in a time, but listen, he showed them that he's a battle axe. I told some folk he bragged and a starving land, but he showed some folk water when I'm thirsty. But he done showed some folk. See, God don't need you to speak for him. He'll speak. He said, we ain't got no need to answer you in this matter. Because listen, sometimes you need to know when to be quiet. You ain't got to brag on God. God will brag on himself. You ain't got to prove God. God will prove himself. And sometimes you just go on in faith, and you ain't got to talk about God for 2 to 3 hours, and you ain't got to do all this stuff that the prosperity gospel tell you. You ain't got to praise your way through the problem. Just be quiet and tell them, I ain't got to regard you in this matter. God will speak for himself. Verse 17. I don't have time, but I can explain to you this. I know what they didn't say. What the New Apostolic Prosperity Gospel tells you, praise your way through it. They wasn't praising. And really, they wasn't trying to get delivered. Because they said he can. And he able.
Yes, he is.
But if he
Yes, he is.
If he don't mean he ain't.
Right now.
He ain't able. I got to give it to you. He said, in case our God to whom we serve, he is able to deliver us from this fiery furnace and deliver us from your hands, O King. But if not, let it be known, we do not serve your God, nor will we worship the golden image that you set up. And I could just stop and explain to you Abel. And see, some of y'all know what Abel means. Abel means he's able.
Yes, sir. Yes, he is.
Able means he can do anything, all things. What is impossible to man is not impossible for God. Man, I'm telling you, it's to be put between a rock and a hard place. And the rocks beside you, rocks behind you, rocks in front of you. And you in a tough situation and it don't look like there's no way out. But you know God can come get you. But if he don't come get you, either way, you're going to be delivered. And everything's going to be, let me give it to you in the modern vernacular, because I feel like preaching now. You do know, you do understand and do know that however it work out, it's going to be all right. If he heal you, it's going to be all right. If he don't heal you, it's going to be all right. If things don't work out the way you pray them, it's still going to be all right. Because he's able, because he has a divine will and a sovereign will. And then let me tell you, verse 19, and I've got to close it. Let me explain to you, this man got hot. Because when people see you really being faithful in a very pressure cooker situation in a fire, listen, this man got hot. He got so hot that his countenance failed. The expression on his face literally turned to just anger. He was viciously angry at these fellas. The text says the expression on his face changed. Because he was smiling, because he thought for sure these boys were going to bow to him. Oh, if I had time, I'd explain to you. Let me tell you, when people can tell you really what they think about you, about just the expression on their face, don't you change your expression. Don't you let your face collapse. In the midst of people looking at you crazy and looking at you with an attitude, your skepticism, you keep your faith intact. You let them change. Man, I wish I had time. I'd explain to you the reason why you losing the battle is because people see you changing when they put pressure on you. And what you need to do is you need to make them change, but you don't change. Listen, they've already stated their position. Don't you let people change you. You change them. You let them be in amazement and wonder why you have not changed. He said, listen, for you three boys, I'm on this thing 7 times harder than it usually was. Then he said, I want the best men I got, mighty men of valor, who an army to bind Rashach, Meshach, and Abednego. I want the most skilled rope tiers to tie them up. And then Nebuchadnezzar, you really got to see verse 21. It's really more that gave us than what it looks and appears, because the text is suggestive that he didn't want to just put them in there so that they could burn. He wanted to put them in there so they could suffer while they burn. Because he did not disrobe them, but the text says in verse 21, he left their clothes on. He wanted to make sure that they suffered while they burned and suffered. Because what the text says, leave these men's clothes, all their coats and their trousers and their turbans and other garments and then cast them, because he wanted them to show no suffer. Oh, I'm trying to explain to you, my brothers and sisters, he wanted them to suffer. But listen, sometimes God wants you to keep on what you got on. Because listen, it's gonna be something to see when they come out. Don't let folk make you take what you got off. Leave it on. Because listen, you don't have to take anything off when you're standing in faith. And the text says, leave all that stuff on. And boy, let me tell you, I got to explain this to you. And boy, that fire was so hot that the men that threw him in there were killed. Boy, this is really what I want to try to explain this to you. I know I'm about to run out of time, but let me explain this to you. You do know the folk who try to kill you, got to kill them. You know the fire was meant for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but the men who tried to throw them in got burned up. That's the unintended consequence of trying to kill somebody that God has his hands on. You know God will take you out before he let you take his children out. And they heated up to kill these three boys. But when they opened up that fiery furnace, the ones who tried to put them in got burned up. I'm trying to explain to you, wait on it. And there's some folks trying to kill you now, trying to throw you in the fire. They're trying to put you closer to your destruction, closer to your fall. Just listen, don't let God handle it. They heat up the fire for these three boys, but they didn't realize the fire wouldn't heat it up for the three boys, but for those who threw them. Some of you folk, the fire you heating up for somebody else. That fire is for that fire is for you. And so verse 23, I'm just doing expository verse by verse, exegetical preaching. And what he says is they fell bound in. And see, I know folk think that it is a walking in, but it is a falling in. They fell down in there. So really, when they fell, they didn't have their footing. They didn't know where they was going to land, how they were going to land. On their back, on their neck. They could have been injured just throwing in. But somehow between the surface of the fiery furnace at the top and the bottom, God put them on there.
Yes, sir.
It's some folk who trying to push you down, to keep you down, to knock you down. But isn't it something that whenever they try to knock you down, you always land on your... You got to know when to shout. Because some of y'all on the, you keep falling on your feet when folks try to push you down, push you in so you fall down. But every time you land on your... And then the king was astonished and rose in haste and said to his counselors, now wait a minute.
Hey, come on with it.
Did we not put three boys
Yeah.
in? And they said, yeah, king. See, I'm finished. That's my last verse. Now, did we not put three boys in there? And they said, oh, yeah, king. And he said, look, I see.
Look at go. Look at go. Hey, look at go. Yes, sir.
One commentator wanted me to tell you this.
Yeah.
They went in with their cloaks, coats, turbans.
Uh-huh.
They had all of this garb and dress on.
Yeah.
But the mighty man of valor tied their hands and their feet and threw them in. God is so precision in their deliverance. God is so precise in his deliverance. You know, rope was made out of cloth. If it wasn't made out of cloth, it was made out of a vine that grew from a tree. But it was a flammable material that they were tied up with. But God burnt the rope, but not their clothes. God burnt the rope, but not their flesh. You got to know when to shout. Because it's some stuff folk put on you.
Yes.
And I see these four men loose, walking.
Hey.
It's, man, I got to quit y'all, but I'm trying to explain to you. He said, I saw him loose, walking in the midst of the fire. Now I got to explain this to him, James. Because see, this is where people don't understand. Now praise comes into play. You know what you need to be doing in the midst of your fiery situations? Walking around loose. You don't know whether you're coming out the flames. They didn't know whether they were coming out of the flame, but they knew as long as they were in the flame, since they were in there, and in the midst of those flames, they might as well do a little walking. While you in your fiery situations, in the midst of your troubles, financially, physically, emotionally, with your family, walk around and give him some. When you're sick, shout a little while. When you're broke, shout a little while. When you're having financial problems, shout. When you're in it. Especially when you got Jesus in there with you.
Yes, sir. In the
And they are not hurt. And the form of the fourth one looks like the Son of God. Verse 27 is the last verse. And I want to talk about it. The A clause in verse 27 are the folk that got him in the fire furnace in the first place. The Chaldeans, all of these other officials who kind of were hating on him. And so when God put him in, put Jesus in there with him, he gave them an audience when they came out. Look what the text says. The satraps, administrators, the governors, and the king's counselors, all of them were gathered together. Gave him an audience. Because see, that's, listen, he'll prepare me a table in the presence of my enemies. Oh, they were hating on you. They didn't think you were going to succeed and make it. And God gave them a first row seat in the VIP to see you. Your deliverance. And they saw these men and that their bodies, the fire didn't have any power to burn up their bodies. And the hair on their head was not singed. And their garments were not affected by the fire. But now listen, I this one right here, Brandon, if I could hoop, I want you to close me out, but I can't hoop. But they didn't even smell like it. Well, sometimes when I go to ball game, I sit by folk who smoke weed, I smell like it. Go to some family gatherings and everybody in there drinking and I smell like alcohol. But man, I'm trying to explain something to you because this is shouting stuff. Because let me tell you, they didn't smell like what they've been in. They didn't smell like what they've been through. They've been in the fire. And you know what fire chemically does and scientifically it does. And what fire does, it destroys whatever comes in it. And what it does destroy, it leaves charred, burned. And if it doesn't burn it, it stains it. And if it doesn't stain it, it gives it a very foul smell. And I've been in some fire.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And I wore this suit intentionally. Listen, I've been through hell, but it don't want to look like hell. I don't want to talk like I've been through hell. Sometimes you can't. Listen, he brought them out. And I'm telling you, the Lord will bring you. Big Al, they try to talk about where I've been, what I did in the past. And the stuff got caught up in me, the stuff that I got caught up in. But look at me now, I'm here. I don't look like one. Yeah, I done some things. I've been in some places, been around some people, but okay. See, some of y'all have been in the church too long, and you're too holy, and you really ain't never done nothing. But some of us have smoked a little grass and it wasn't. Some of us drunk a little liquor. Some of us been in the club, and some of us been shot at some folks. Some of us been in the pen and been at the hospital, but God brought us through it all. And we don't look like what we've been through. And God, I got to close, but let me do the Baptist preacher thing since I can't hood. Because this suit a little too tight and I really can't trust it by shouting too much. And it's made of wool and I can't get too hot, so that's why I gotta close this comment. But I gotta do the Baptist preacher thing. Jesus Christ went into an empty grave. And let me tell you, he went in there.